1919. The Convent of San Giovanni Rotondo. The Vision during Nocturnal Prayer. The night of September 14, 1919, descended upon the convent of San Giovanni Rotondo with the characteristic stillness that marked the late hours in that remote corner of southern Italy. Within the ancient walls of the monastery, where generations of Capuchin friars had offered their prayers to heaven, Padre Pio knelt alone in the choir, his figure barely visible in the dim light that filtered through the narrow windows. The surrounding silence was profound, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind against stone and the distant sound of nocturnal creatures outside the convent walls. As he prayed in solitude, the friar entered into a state of deep recollection, his consciousness withdrawing from the physical world around him and penetrating into dimensions that few mortals ever experienced. His body remained motionless in the choir stall, but his spirit had ventured into territories where the boundaries between the visible and invisible worlds grew thin and permeable. According to the spiritual narrative that would later emerge from this experience, something extraordinary occurred during those dark hours of prayer, something that would mark him profoundly and add another layer to the mystical reputation he was already beginning to acquire among those who knew him. In this state of profound contemplation, Padre Pio perceived what he would later describe as a vision, though it came not in the form of ordinary images that one might see with physical eyes. Instead, it manifested as an overwhelming spiritual experience that transcended normal sensory perception. He became aware of a presence, a soul that carried the marks of sacred ordination, a priest who had once stood at the altar and consecrated the holy mysteries. But this soul was enveloped in profound darkness, a spiritual obscurity so dense and oppressive that it communicated itself to the mystic friar with devastating clarity. The vision revealed signs of deep guilt weighing upon this priestly soul, though the specific nature of these transgressions remained veiled in mystery. What Padre Pio experienced was not merely an intellectual awareness or a detached observation of another's spiritual state. Rather, the suffering of this soul penetrated into his own being with such intensity that he felt it within his own body. The pain was not physical in the ordinary sense, yet it was no less real, a spiritual agony that manifested in tears that flowed freely down his bearded face, and a silence so profound that it seemed to emanate from the depths of his being. This was not the first time the friar had experienced such mystical phenomena. Already bearing the stigmata, the wounds of Christ that had appeared on his body the previous year, Padre Pio was no stranger to experiences that defied rational explanation and connected him in mysterious ways to the sufferings of others and to the passion of Christ himself. Yet each such experience was unique in its intensity and its particular message, and this nocturnal vision carried its own distinctive weight of sorrow and revelation. The hours passed slowly as he remained in this state, his prayers taking on a character of intense intercession for the soul he had perceived in such distress. The darkness of the night outside seemed to mirror the spiritual darkness he had witnessed in the vision, and his tears continued to flow as he offered himself as a victim soul, willing to bear the sufferings of others in union with Christ's redemptive sacrifice. This concept of victimhood, of offering one's own sufferings for the salvation of others, was central to Padre Pio's spirituality and to the mystical tradition in which he stood. When dawn finally broke over San Giovanni Rotondo, illuminating the rough stone walls of the convent and the rugged landscape of the Gargano Peninsula beyond, Padre Pio emerged from his prolonged prayer, transformed by what he had experienced. The vision had left an indelible mark upon his soul, adding to the weight of spiritual burdens he already carried. Those who saw him in the days that followed noticed the increased gravity in his demeanor, the deeper sadness in his eyes, though he spoke little of what had occurred during that September night. The significance of this vision, according to those who later studied Padre Pio's mystical experiences, lay not merely in its occurrence, but in what it revealed about the nature of his spiritual mission. He was given to see the hidden states of souls, particularly those consecrated to God's service, and to bear in his own person the weight of their failures and sufferings. This gift, if such a burdensome awareness could be called a gift, placed him in a unique position of intercession, making him a bridge between heaven and earth, between the sins of humanity and the mercy of God.
The narrative of this vision would become part of the larger tapestry of Padre Pio's mystical life, recorded by his spiritual directors and preserved in the correspondence and testimonies that documented his extraordinary journey. It illustrated the hidden dimension of sanctity, the invisible sufferings that accompanied the visible manifestations of holiness, and the mysterious ways in which souls are connected in the communion of saints. For Padre Pio, that September night in 1919 was not merely a singular mystical experience, but a continuation of his ongoing participation in the redemptive suffering of Christ, a participation that would continue until his death nearly 50 years later. The convent of San Giovanni Rotondo would continue to be the stage for countless such experiences, and Padre Pio would continue to pray in that same choir, bearing in his body and soul the mysteries that were revealed to him in the silence of nocturnal prayer. The vision of the priestly soul in darkness remained with him, a reminder of the gravity of sacred responsibilities and the depths of divine mercy available even to those who had fallen far from grace. The confessional booth in the San Giovanni Rotondo monastery was a cramped space, barely large enough for two men to sit with any comfort. The wooden panels, dark with age and countless whispered sins, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was here, in March of 1923, that Padre Pio found himself sharing something he had never intended to reveal, not to any living soul, not in words that could be repeated or remembered. Father Benedetto had noticed the change in his fellow friar weeks before. Padre Pio had always carried a certain heaviness. The stigmata alone would have been burden enough for any man, but this was different. This was a darkness that seemed to follow him through the corridors, a shadow that lengthened even in bright afternoon light. When Father Benedetto finally insisted on speaking with him privately, Padre Pio had resisted at first, claiming there was nothing to discuss, nothing that prayer could not resolve. But Father Benedetto was persistent, and Padre Pio was tired, so terribly tired. They sat in the confessional not as priest and penitent, but as brothers, though the sacred space lent gravity to whatever would be said. Father Benedetto waited in the silence, knowing that some truths require their own time to emerge, cannot be rushed or coaxed like reluctant children. The afternoon sun filtered through the high windows of the chapel beyond, creating dusty columns of light that did not quite reach where they sat. Padre Pio began speaking in a voice so low that Father Benedetto had to lean forward, his ear nearly pressed against the latticed screen that separated them. He spoke of a confession that had begun like any other, 3 weeks prior, on a Tuesday morning when the chapel had been nearly empty. A man had come, Padre Pio said, a priest from another parish, though he would not say which one or where. The man had knelt and begun his confession in the traditional manner, but something had been wrong from the very beginning. Padre Pio described how the words coming through the screen had seemed normal at first, the usual catalog of small failings and human weaknesses, but underneath them he had sensed something else, something that made his hands tremble where they rested on his knees. He had tried to focus on the man's words, to listen with the compassion that Christ demanded of those who heard confessions, but his vision had begun to blur. The wooden screen before him seemed to darken and then dissolve entirely. What he saw then, he told Father Benedetto, was not the chapel, not the kneeling figure of the priest on the other side of the partition. Instead, he saw an abyss. It opened before him like a wound in the fabric of reality itself, a chasm so deep that no light penetrated to its bottom. From within that darkness came a sound, a cry that was somehow muffled, as if coming through water or thick cloth, and yet it pierced him more deeply than any scream could have. It was the sound of a soul, he said, and he knew with absolute certainty whose soul it was. The vision had lasted only moments, perhaps less, but in that brief span, Padre Pio had understood everything. The priest kneeling before him had corrupted innocence. The phrase itself was almost too delicate for what Padre Pio had perceived, the ruin of souls that should have been protected, the betrayal of trust so fundamental that its breaking created ripples that spread far beyond the immediate victims. He had seen, in that supernatural moment, the full weight of what this man had done, not just the physical acts, but their spiritual consequences, the way they had torn holes in the fabric of grace that should have surrounded those innocent ones. The soul he had glimpsed in that abyss was alive, Padre Pio explains to Father Benedetto. The man still walked and breathed, still celebrated Mass, still heard confessions himself, perhaps. But spiritually, the soul was wounded in a way that Padre Pio struggled to articulate. Wounded unto death, he finally said, though those words felt inadequate. It was as if the soul had already begun the process of dying, of separating itself from the source of all life, even while the body continued its earthly functions. The wound was mortal, not in the sense that it could not be healed, for God's mercy was infinite, but in the sense that it was of such gravity that without divine intervention, without true repentance of a depth that seemed almost impossible, the soul would eventually succumb entirely. The confession had been interrupted then. Padre Pio could not remember exactly how or why. Perhaps someone had entered the chapel. Perhaps he himself had made some sound of distress. Perhaps the vision had simply been too much for him to bear while maintaining the facade of normalcy. The priest had risen and left quickly, muttering something about returning another time, and Padre Pio had been left alone in the confessional, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the armrests to steady them. Father Benedetto listened to all of this without interruption, and when Padre Pio finally fell silent, the only sound was their breathing in that enclosed space. After a long moment, Father Benedetto asked the question that hung between them. What had Padre Pio done with this knowledge? Had he reported it to his superiors, to the bishop, to anyone who might investigate? Padre Pio's answer came slowly. He had prayed, he said. He had prayed without ceasing for 3 weeks, begging God for guidance, for wisdom, for some sign of what he should do. The seal of confession was sacred, even for a confession interrupted and never completed. He had not heard enough to constitute a full confession, and yet he had seen too much to pretend ignorance. He was trapped, he said, between the duty to protect the innocent and the duty to preserve the sacred trust of the confessional. Every path forward seemed to lead to betrayal of one kind or another. Father Benedetto sat with this burden now shared, feeling its weight settle onto his own shoulders. The light outside had shifted, the afternoon moving toward evening, and the confessional had grown darker. Neither man moved to light a candle. In the darkness, Padre Pio spoke one more time, his voice barely a whisper. The worst part, he said, was not the vision itself, terrible as it had been. The worst part was knowing that the man was still out there, still trusted, still with access to those who could not protect themselves. The worst part was the certainty that more harm would come, more souls wounded, more innocence destroyed, and he, Padre Pio, sat helpless in this monastery, bound by vows and sacred duties, able to do nothing but pray and watch and wait for God to act. The morning of November 2nd, 1928, dawned cold and gray over San Giovanni Rotondo. The Feast of All Souls, the day set aside by the Church to remember and pray for the departed, had always weighed heavily on Padre Pio. The veil between the living and the dead seemed thinner on this day, and he felt it in his bones, in the constant ache of his stigmata, in the heaviness that settled over his shoulders like a physical cloak as he prepared to celebrate Mass. The chapel was fuller than usual, as it always was on this particular feast day. The faithful came in their mourning clothes, many still wearing black for losses both recent and long past, clutching rosaries and prayer cards with the names of their beloved dead inscribed in careful script. They came seeking intercession, hoping that the prayers offered today might ease the suffering of souls in purgatory, might hasten their journey toward the eternal light. Padre Pio understood this hope, shared it even, though he knew better than most how mysterious were the ways of divine justice and mercy. He had celebrated the Mass for the dead hundreds of times, knew the Latin prayers by heart, could perform the ritual movements even when his wounded hands caused him such pain that tears would slide unbidden down his cheeks. The black vestments felt heavier than usual as he put them on, as if they carried not just symbolic but actual weight, the accumulated grief of all the mourners who would stand before him. Brother Augustine helped him dress, noticing how Padre Pio's hands trembled more than usual, how he seemed to be steeling himself for something, though for what the younger friar could not say. The Mass began as it always did, with the prayers at the foot of the altar, the acknowledgement of sin and unworthiness. Padre Pio's voice was steady as he recited the familiar words, though those closest to the altar noticed a quality to it they could not quite name, a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest.
The congregation responded in their practiced way, the rhythms of the liturgy as familiar to them as their own heartbeats. It was during the canon of the Mass, that most sacred moment when the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, that the vision seized him. One moment Padre Pio was raising the consecrated host, his wounded hands visible to all who watched. The next moment he had gone rigid, frozen in that position of elevation, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. The host remained raised, trembling slightly in his grasp, while seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. What Padre Pio saw in that moment was a soul suspended in a space that was neither the physical world nor the realm of the dead as human minds conceived it. The soul was recognizably human in form, though translucent, almost ethereal, and it wore the vestments of a priest. But these vestments were not the clean white and gold of celebration, nor even the black of mourning. They seemed to be burning, though there were no flames, no smoke, no physical fire at all. The burning came from within, a terrible incandescence that radiated from the center of the soul outward, and the priest's face was contorted not in physical agony, but in something far worse. Padre Pio understood, in the way that knowledge comes in visions without need for words or explanation, that this was a soul undergoing purification. But this was not the gentle cleansing fire that theological texts spoke of in abstract terms, not the patient burning away of venial sins and earthly attachments. This was something far more terrible, a fire of consciousness itself, a burning awareness that consumed without destroying, that revealed without offering any escape from what it revealed. The soul was being forced to understand, truly and completely understand every consequence of every action taken during life. Padre Pio could sense the torrent of knowledge flooding through that translucent form, the full weight of every choice, every word, every deed now laid bare in perfect clarity. There was no possibility of self-deception here, no rationalizations or justifications, no comfortable lies that the living tell themselves to sleep at night. The soul saw itself as God saw it, and the horror of that vision was the fire that burned. But it was not the general catalogue of human failing that caused the most intense suffering.
Padre Pio perceived, with a clarity that made his own heart clench in sympathetic anguish, that the worst of the burning came from one particular category of sin. The soul was being made to understand, with perfect and complete empathy, what it had done to children. Not in the abstract, not as theological concepts of sin and transgression, but in the concrete and terrible reality of lived experience. The soul was being forced to feel what they had felt, those innocent ones who had been betrayed and corrupted. Every moment of confusion, every instant of pain, both physical and spiritual, every day and week and month and year of aftermath, of trauma that rippled outward through an entire life like cracks through glass. The soul felt the fear of the children, felt their inability to understand what was happening to them, felt their desperate hope that someone would save them, and the crushing despair when no salvation came. The soul felt the way trust itself had been poisoned in them, how the corruption of their bodies had led to a corruption of their ability to trust any authority, any guide, any supposed protector. And more than this, worse than this, the soul was being made to understand the spiritual consequences. Padre Pio saw how the vision showed the priest's soul the way grace had been blocked in those young lives, how the trauma had created barriers between the innocent ones and God's love. Some had turned away from faith entirely, unable to reconcile a loving God with what had been done to them by his supposed representative. Others had remained in the church, but wounded, perpetually bleeding from invisible injuries, their spiritual lives stunted and twisted by what they had endured. A few had gone on to hurt others in turn, the corruption spreading like a disease, and the priest's soul was being made to understand that those sins too, those secondary and tertiary rings of damage, were laid at his account. The fire of this understanding was the punishment Padre Pio suddenly grasped. There was no external torturer, no demons with pitchforks, no physical flames licking at the soul. The torment was intrinsic, was the natural and inevitable result of finally, truly seeing oneself without the protective filters of ego and rationalization. The soul was being purified not by arbitrary divine retribution, but the simple and terrible process of confronting the full truth of what it had been and what it had done. Time moved strangely in the vision.
Padre Pio could not tell if what he was witnessing represented a moment or an age, whether this burning awareness lasted seconds or centuries, or some span of time that had no earthly equivalent. The soul seemed trapped in an eternal present, always discovering anew the full horror of its actions, always experiencing for the first time the complete understanding of the suffering it had caused. And yet there was something else too, something that kept the vision from being completely hopeless. Beneath the fire, or perhaps within it, Padre Pio sensed the presence of mercy. The burning itself was an act of love, a refusal to allow the soul to remain in the comfortable delusions that had characterized its earthly life. God loved this soul too much to allow it to continue in blindness. And so the fire burned away every false comfort, every self-serving interpretation, every protective lie. The pain was real and terrible, but it was not meaningless. It had a purpose, an end towards which it moved, though that end might be impossibly distant. The vision released him as suddenly as it had seized him. Padre Pio gasped, nearly dropping the host before recovering himself, lowering it with shaking hands to complete the consecration. His face was wet with tears he did not remember shedding, and his entire body trembled as if with fever. The congregation stirred uneasily, sensing that something had occurred, though they could not say what. Brother Augustine stepped forward instinctively, ready to catch Padre Pio if he fell, but the older priest waved him away with a small gesture. The Mass continued. Padre Pio completed the ritual, distributed communion to the faithful, pronounced the final blessing. His voice was hoarse but steady, his movements careful and deliberate. Only those who knew him well noticed how he gripped the altar for support, how he seemed to age years in the span of that single liturgy.
When it was over and the chapel had emptied, he remained kneeling at the altar rail, his head bowed, his lips moving in silent prayer. Brother Augustine waited nearby, uncertain whether to approach or leave him in solitude. Finally, after nearly an hour had passed, Padre Pio rose stiffly and turned toward the sacristy. As he passed the younger friar, he spoke only a single sentence, his voice barely audible. "Pray for priests," he said. "Pray especially for those who have fallen, for their suffering will be beyond anything we can imagine in this life." The August heat in San Giovanni Rotondo was oppressive even at night, the kind of thick, still air that made breathing feel like work. The stone walls of the monastery, which kept the interior cool during the day, seemed to radiate stored warmth once the sun went down, turning the corridors into ovens. Most of the friars had opened their cell windows wide, hoping for even the slightest breeze, but Padre Pio's window remained shuttered. He had learned long ago that his nights were rarely his own, and privacy, even the illusion of it, had become precious to him. He had not intended to keep vigil that night. His body ached with a bone-deep weariness that prayer alone could not ease, and Father Guardian had been insisting that he needed more rest. The stigmata had been particularly painful lately, the wounds weeping more than usual, soaking through the bandages that he changed multiple times each day. His hands throbbed with a steady pulse that matched his heartbeat, and the wound in his side felt as though it had been freshly made, though it had been with him for 16 years now. But sleep would not come. He had lain on his narrow cot for hours, listening to the sounds of the monastery settling into its nighttime rhythms, the distant snoring of Brother Marcello, the soft footsteps of whoever had night duty in the chapel, the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to the temperature change. His mind would not quiet, kept circling back to a letter he had received that morning from a woman in Naples whose son had left the church, who begged him to pray for the young man's return to faith. There was something in her desperate words that had lodged itself in his chest like a splinter. Finally, sometime after midnight, he had risen and made his way to the small private oratory that Father Guardian had grudgingly allowed him to use when the main chapel became too public, too crowded with the faithful who came seeking his blessing and guidance. The oratory was barely larger than his cell, with space only for a simple altar, a crucifix on the wall, and a kneeler worn smooth by years of use. A single votive candle provided the only light, casting long shadows that danced with his movements. Padre Pio knelt with difficulty, his knees protesting the hard wood of the kneeler, and began the rosary. The familiar prayers came automatically, his lips forming the words while his mind drifted in that strange state between wakefulness and sleep, between earthly awareness and spiritual receptivity. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. The beads slipped through his bandaged fingers, the rhythm of the prayer like a heartbeat, like breathing, like the tide coming in and going out. He was midway through the sorrowful mysteries, contemplating the agony in the garden, when the temperature in the small room seemed to drop precipitously. His breath became visible in the candlelight, small puffs of vapor that dissipated slowly in the suddenly cold air. The candle flame guttered and nearly went out, then steadied again, burning with an unnatural brightness that hurt to look at directly. Padre Pio's first instinct was to rise, to flee whatever presence had entered the oratory, but his body would not obey. He remained frozen on the kneeler, the rosary beads cutting into his palms where he gripped them too tightly, his eyes fixed on the crucifix above the altar. The shadows on the wall began to move independently of the candle flame, coalescing into a shape that was almost but not quite human, a figure that seemed to be trying to manifest fully but could not quite breach the barrier between its realm and the physical world. Then the vision opened before him like a door swinging wide. The oratory was still there. He could still feel the kneeler beneath his knees, still smell the wax of the votive candle, but superimposed over this reality was another one, a place that existed in some dimension he could not name. It was a field of darkness, vast and featureless, stretching in all directions farther than sight could reach. The darkness was not merely the absence of light, but something more active, more oppressive, a weight that pressed down from above and up from below simultaneously. In the center of this dark field stood a figure. Padre Pio could not make out details at first, could not tell if it was man or woman, young or old, but he sensed immediately the crushing despair that emanated from it. The figure stood perfectly still, arms at its sides, head bowed, and from its posture Padre Pio understood that it had been standing this way for a very long time, perhaps for what felt like eternity to the soul trapped in that place. This was a soul in torment. He understood that immediately. But as his perception adjusted to the strange light, or lack of light, of that place, he began to notice something else. Near the figure's chest, barely visible against the overwhelming darkness, was a tiny point of light. It was so small, so faint, that at first he thought he might be imagining it, a trick of his eyes trying to find something, anything to focus on in that terrible void. But no, it was real. A flame no bigger than a pinprick, flickering weakly as if about to be extinguished at any moment, but stubbornly, impossibly, still burning. Knowledge came to him then without words, without explanation, simply downloading itself directly into his understanding. This was a soul that had committed grievous sins, sins of a nature so dark that Padre Pio's mind recoiled from looking at them directly. Sins against innocence, against trust, against the sacred duties of priesthood. The same category of transgression he had encountered before, in the confessional in 1923, in the vision during Mass in 1928. Another predator, another betrayer, another one who had used his position and authority to corrupt those who should have been protected. The soul was not yet condemned, Padre Pio understood. This was not hell, not the final and irrevocable separation from God that theology spoke of. This was something else, a state between states, a waiting place where the soul hovered in terrible uncertainty. The darkness was the weight of the sins themselves, the accumulated spiritual gravity of all the harm that had been done. It was the natural consequence of choosing evil, the inevitable result of turning away from light toward shadow. The soul had made itself into this darkness through its choices, had wrapped itself in this suffocating void through repeated acts of betrayal and corruption. But the flame, that tiny, persistent flame, was something different. Padre Pio stared at it, willing it to grow brighter, terrified it might go out entirely. He understood intuitively what it represented. It was the last remnant of grace, the final thread connecting this soul to the divine source. It was the possibility, however remote, however unlikely, of true repentance. Not the shallow regret of being caught, not the fear of punishment, but genuine sorrow for the harm done, authentic desire to be transformed, real willingness to face the full truth of what one had been and to choose differently. The flame flickered, dimmed, and for a moment Padre Pio thought it had gone out.
His heart clenched in his chest, a physical pain that had nothing to do with his stigmata. But then the tiny light steadied again, burning with that same weak but persistent glow. It was not getting brighter, but neither was it being extinguished. It simply was, existing in defiance of the darkness that surrounded it, maintaining its presence against impossible odds. Padre Pio realized he was being shown this for a reason. This was not mere curiosity or mystical tourism. He was being called to intercede, to pray for this soul that stood in such desperate circumstances. The thought filled him with something close to revulsion. How could he pray for such a one? How could he ask God's mercy for someone who had destroyed innocence, who had used sacred trust as a weapon, who had led children into darkness and left them there bleeding and alone? And yet the flame continued to flicker, and yet mercy remained possible. God had not given up on this soul, Padre Pio realized with a shock that felt almost like betrayal. God was still waiting, still hoping, still offering the possibility of redemption even to one who had fallen so far.
The divine patience was beyond anything Padre Pio could comprehend, a mercy so vast and so incomprehensible that it made his own capacity for forgiveness look like a shallow puddle next to an ocean. He found himself weeping without knowing when the tears had started. They ran down his face and into his beard, dropping onto his folded hands where they mixed with the blood that always seemed to be seeping from his wounds. His whole body shook with the force of his sobs, though he made no sound that might disturb the other friars sleeping in their cells nearby. This was a grief too deep for noise, too profound for ordinary expression. Slowly, with enormous effort, Padre Pio began to pray. Not the formal prayers of the rosary or the liturgy, but something more raw and desperate. He prayed for the soul standing in that dark field, prayed that the flame would not go out, prayed that somehow, impossibly, true repentance might take root even in such corrupted soil. He prayed for the victims, too, for all those innocents who had been harmed, asking God to heal what seemed beyond healing, to restore what had been stolen, to bring light into the darkness that had been forced upon them. Hours passed, though Padre Pio had no sense of time. The vision remained before him, the dark field, the standing figure, the tiny flame. He prayed until his voice was gone, until his body was so stiff he could barely move, until exhaustion dragged at him like weights attached to his limbs. And still he prayed, offering his own suffering as intercession, uniting the pain of his stigmata with his petitions, hoping that somehow his prayers might tip the balance, might fan that tiny flame into something stronger. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside, the vision slowly faded. The dark field dissolved like mist in sunlight. The figure became transparent and then vanished entirely, and Padre Pio found himself back in the small oratory, still kneeling, though his legs had long since gone numb. The votive candle had burned down to a stub, its flame sputtering in the last of the wax. His face was crusted with dried tears, and his bandages were soaked through with blood. But in his heart was something unexpected. Hope. Fragile and tentative, but real. The flame had not gone out. Mercy was still possible, even in the darkest circumstances, even for the most terrible sins. Repentance, true and deep and transforming, could still occur. The soul was not yet lost, not yet condemned, not yet beyond the reach of divine love. Brother Augustine found him there an hour later, slumped against the wall, barely conscious. As the younger friar helped him to his feet and supported him back to his cell, Padre Pio whispered something that Brother Augustine would remember for the rest of his life. "Never stop praying," he said. "Never give up hope. While there is life, while there is breath, while even the smallest flame still burns, mercy is possible, even for the worst of us, especially for the worst of us." The year 1947 brought with it an unusual chill to San Giovanni Rotondo, as if the earth itself sensed the approaching end of things. Padre Pio had grown increasingly frail over the months, his already spare frame becoming skeletal, his movements slow and deliberate as those of a man moving under water. The stigmata that had marked his body for nearly 3 decades seemed to burn with renewed intensity, as if determined to exact every last measure of suffering before releasing their hold. He was 80 years old, though those who saw him daily would have guessed him far older, worn down by decades of mystical experiences that had used his body as their instrument. Father Alessio had been assigned to attend to Padre Pio during these final months, a duty he approached with equal parts reverence and trepidation.
The older priest had always been difficult to care for, fiercely independent despite his infirmities, resistant to any fussing or special treatment. But lately he had softened somewhat, accepting help with more grace, as if he understood that his time for stubborn self-sufficiency had passed. Father Alessio brought him meals he barely touched, changed bandages that were always soaked through with blood and plasma, and sat with him during the long nights when sleep refused to come. It was during one of these vigils, in the deep hours of a November night when the darkness seemed absolute and eternal, that Padre Pio began to speak of the vision.
Father Alessio had been dozing in the chair beside the bed, his breviary open on his lap, when Padre Pio's voice startled him awake. The older priest was sitting upright despite his weakness, his eyes fixed on something across the room that Father Alessio could not see, his bandaged hands gripping the blanket with surprising strength. "He is here," Padre Pio said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a weight that made Father Alessio's skin prickle. "The one I have seen before. The priest, the soul I have prayed for all these years." Father Alessio knew immediately what he meant. Padre Pio had spoken before, in fragments and careful allusions, about a particular soul that had haunted his prayers for decades. A priest who had committed unspeakable acts against children, whose spiritual condition had been revealed to Padre Pio through a series of visions that had marked turning points in his own mystical journey. Father Alessio had never pressed for details, sensing that some knowledge was too heavy to be shared casually, but he had witnessed the toll these visions took on the older friar, had seen how they drained him of vitality and left him hollow-eyed and trembling. Now, Padre Pio began to describe what he was seeing, his words coming slowly, as if he were translating from a language that had no direct equivalent in human speech. The room around them, the simple cell with its narrow bed and wooden crucifix, seemed to fade in his perception, becoming translucent, insubstantial. In its place emerged another space entirely, a realm that existed beyond or beneath or within the physical world, accessible only through the strange doorways that opened in mystical consciousness. It was a place of light, Padre Pio said, but not the gentle golden light of sunrise or the warm glow of candles. This was a light that revealed rather than illuminated, that penetrated rather than merely touched surfaces. It was the kind of light that made hiding impossible, that rendered every shadow transparent, every veil ineffective. It was a light that saw through flesh and bone and into the very essence of a soul, exposing everything that lay there without mercy and without judgment, simply revealing what was. In the center of this light stood the soul he had seen before, the priest whose spiritual journey Padre Pio had been witnessing across decades. Father Alessio listened as Padre Pio described how the figure had changed since the last vision in 1934. Where before the soul had stood in darkness, with only a tiny flame flickering at its chest, now it stood fully manifest in this penetrating light, every detail visible, every aspect exposed. The priestly vestments were gone, stripped away along with every other external marker of identity or status. What remained was simply the soul itself, naked before the light, unable to hide or dissemble or pretend. Around the soul, Padre Pio continued, the light seemed to organize itself into a structure that reminded him of a courtroom, though there were no physical walls or furniture, no judge's bench or witness stand. It was more that the light itself created zones of different intensity, areas of focus and attention, as if the space were arranging itself for the purpose of examination. This was a tribunal, Padre Pio understood, but not of the earthly kind. There were no advocates or prosecutors, no jury of peers, no legal procedures or technical arguments. There was only the soul and the light and the truth. The soul's entire life played out before it, Padre Pio said, though played was too simple a word for what he was witnessing. It was not a linear progression, not a chronological review from birth to death. Instead, every moment existed simultaneously, every choice and action and thought laid out like a vast tapestry that could be perceived all at once in its terrible completeness. Nothing was hidden, nothing could be minimized or explained away, nothing could be forgotten or suppressed. The full truth of what this soul had been and done was simply present, undeniable, inescapable. Father Alessio found himself leaning forward despite his fear, caught by the intensity in Padre Pio's voice. The older priest's eyes had taken on a strange quality, as if he were looking at something infinitely distant and infinitely close at the same time. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks, but he seemed unaware of them. his entire attention focused on the vision unfolding before him. Padre Pio described how the soul was being made to understand not just its actions, but their consequences, the full ripple effect of every choice radiating outward through time and space. He saw again, as he had in previous visions, the children who had been harmed, but now he saw them not as abstract victims, but as complete persons, each with their own infinite complexity, their own sacred dignity, their own irreplaceable uniqueness. He saw how the abuse had wounded them not just in the moment, but across their entire lives, how trauma had shaped their relationships, their capacity for trust, their ability to experience joy and intimacy and faith. And he saw more. He saw how some of the victims had grown into adulthood carrying wounds that never healed, how they had struggled with addiction and depression and suicidal thoughts, how relationships had failed and families had fractured under the weight of unspoken pain. He saw how a few had left the church entirely, unable to reconcile their suffering with belief in a loving God. He saw how others had stayed but remained forever damaged, their faith twisted into something fearful and small. And he saw, most painfully, how some had gone on to harm others in turn, the violence done to them creating a template for violence that echoed forward through generations. All of this the soul was being made to see and understand with perfect clarity, not as judgment imposed from outside, but as simple recognition of cause and effect, action and consequence, choice and outcome. The light revealed the truth, and the truth was enough. There was no need for divine anger or punishment, no need for demons or flames or torture. The soul's own recognition of what it had done, the full and complete understanding of the harm it had caused, was weight enough to crush it utterly. But Padre Pio saw something else too, something that made his voice crack as he described it to Father Alessio. Alongside the revelation of harm and consequence, there was also the revelation of every moment of mercy, every instance where grace had been offered and received or rejected, every opportunity for repentance that had presented itself across the span of the soul's life. He saw the tiny flame he had glimpsed in the 1934 vision, and he understood now what it had meant. It was the presence of conscience, never quite extinguished, the small voice that had continued to whisper the truth even when the soul had tried desperately not to hear it. The soul had experienced moments of genuine remorse, Padre Pio saw, though they had been fleeting and quickly suppressed. There had been nights when the priest had wept alone in his room, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had done. There had been mornings when he had stood before the altar to celebrate Mass and felt the full hypocrisy of his position, the terrible contradiction between the sacred words he spoke and the profane acts he committed. There had been confessions, stammering and incomplete, attempts to articulate sins he could barely admit to himself. But there had also been evasion and rationalization, layers upon layers of self-deception that the priest had constructed to make his life bearable. He had told himself that the children wanted it, that he was teaching them about love, that the church's rules were too strict and unrealistic. He had blamed his victims for tempting him, had convinced himself that the harm was minimal, had minimized and justified and explained away until the truth was buried under so many lies that he almost believed them himself. Almost, but not quite. The flame had never gone out completely. Now, in this tribunal of light, every self-serving lie was stripped away. The soul saw itself as it truly was, as it had always been beneath the comfortable delusions, and the agony of that recognition was more terrible than any external punishment could ever be. This was the fire of purgatory, Padre Pio understood suddenly, or perhaps even the torment of hell itself. Not flames imposed from without, but the burning shame and horror of finally seeing oneself clearly, of understanding completely the gap between what one should have been and what one actually was. Yet even here, even in this moment of absolute revelation and crushing recognition, Padre Pio sensed the presence of mercy. It was there in the light itself, in the very act of revelation. A soul truly lost, truly damned, would not be capable of this kind of recognition. the ability to see one's sins clearly, to understand the full weight of the harm one had caused, to feel genuine remorse rather than mere self-pity, these were themselves signs of grace at work. The light was not just revealing, but also transforming, burning away the layers of self-deception and leaving something more authentic, more true, however painful that truth might be.
Padre Pio watched as the soul stood in that revealing light, and he understood that he was witnessing a moment that was both judgment and invitation. Judgment because the truth was being fully acknowledged, the harm fully recognized, the consequences fully understood. But also invitation, because even now, even here, the choice remained. The soul could embrace this truth and allow it to transform completely, could surrender to the burning away of everything false and emerge remade. Or it could cling to the remnants of its self-deception, could refuse the full recognition of what it had been, could choose the comfortable darkness of denial over the painful light of truth. Which choice the soul would make, Padre Pio could not see. The vision seemed to freeze at this moment of decision, this eternal instant where everything hung in the balance. He wanted to cry out, to urge the soul toward transformation, to pray with every fiber of his being that mercy would triumph. But he found he could not speak, could not interfere in this most intimate of moments. This was between the soul and God, and he was merely a witness, granted the privilege and burden of seeing, but not the power to intervene. The vision began to fade then, the light gradually dimming, the figure of the soul becoming transparent and then vanishing entirely. Padre Pio felt himself being drawn back into his body, into the small cell where Father Alessio sat watching him with wide, frightened eyes. The transition was painful, like being squeezed through a narrow opening, and he gasped with the shock of it, his hands flying to his chest where his heart hammered against his ribs. Father Alessio rushed to his side, offering water that Padre Pio waved away. For long minutes he simply sat there, breathing hard, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. When he finally opened his eyes and looked at the younger priest, Father Alessio was struck by the expression on his face. It was sorrow and hope mixed together in equal measure, grief and joy so intertwined they could not be separated. "Write this down," Padre Pio said, his voice hoarse but urgent. "Write it so that others will know. God is infinitely just and infinitely merciful, both at once without contradiction. Every soul will face the full truth of its life, every action revealed, every consequence understood. Nothing can be hidden, nothing can be denied. The light sees all and reveals all. This is justice." He paused, gathering strength, then continued. "But the light itself is mercy. Do you understand? The very fact that we are shown the truth, that we are given the capacity to see ourselves clearly, this is grace. Condemnation would be to leave us in our comfortable lies, to allow us to remain blind to what we truly are. The burning shame of recognition, terrible as it is actually love. It is God refusing to give up on us, refusing to let us settle for being less than we were created to be." Father Alessio wrote frantically, trying to capture every word. When he looked up, Padre Pio was staring at the crucifix on the wall, tears streaming down his face. The older priest spoke once more, so quietly that Father Alessio had to strain to hear. "I do not know if that soul chose transformation or continued in its self-deception. I was not shown the end, only the moment of decision. But I know this, I know it with absolute certainty. Every soul is given that moment, that choice, even the worst of us, even those who have harmed the innocent, who have betrayed sacred trust, who have chosen darkness over light again and again. The opportunity for genuine repentance, true transformation, is always offered, always. What we do with that opportunity, that is on us. But the offer itself, that is pure grace." 3 weeks later, Padre Pio died quietly in his cell, Father Alessio at his side. His last words were a prayer for all priests, especially those who had fallen, that they might have the courage to face the truth of what they had done, and the faith to believe that transformation was still possible.